In this video, we're gonna tell you the full story behind Captain Marvel, aka Carol Danvers. How Carol came to be. You might think that Carol Danvers is just a regular human who is thrown into all that trademark Marvel drama and adventure, but you'd only be half correct. That's because she was destined for something more than the pedestrian life of a normal citizen right from the start. Carol is half human. Her father was a man named Joe Danvers who was a US Navy veteran. On the other hand, her mom was a full-blooded Kree warrior named Mary L. In fact, Carol's name was derived from the traditional Kree name Kal-El, which translates into the English word champion. But Carol had no idea about her Kree heritage during her early years. The truth is, she grew up in a rather old-fashioned American family, and we mean old-fashioned because her dad wouldn't even let her go to college and instead proposed that she find a good husband when she grew up. Despite her home's admittedly discriminatory views, there was no stopping Carol from living a life full of adventure. She was always dreaming of traveling the skies and stars when she was young. Eventually, Carol came of age and decided to leave the Danvers household to follow her dreams of flying. To do that, she entered the US Air Force and ultimately graduated with flying colors during her time there. Carol would then find herself becoming one of the best pilots in the Air Force, so much so that she was assigned to test experimental aircraft for them. In one faithful mission, Carol took out a cutting-edge jet fighter made by Stark Industries. This test flight went awry when she found herself abducted by a villain named Ghazi Rashid. Carol would then endure all sorts of torture, but it's at this point that she'd prove she was built for action when she managed to escape her cell and take out Ghazi in the process. The whole ordeal had a silver lining too, as Carol would be promoted to USAF Colonel shortly after. Carol would get a taste of superheroes even before she became a full-fledged crime fighter, as she'd meet the likes of Nick Fury, Wolverine, and Black Widow during this time. Keep in mind though, that she didn't have any superpowers at this time, she was just that much of an action hero. And here's a little fun fact too, Carol and Logan had a thing for each other, which developed over the course of several missions that they undertook as partners. Nothing ultimately came of it though, and the two would go their separate ways eventually, with Carol inadvertently playing a critical part in Marvel's Mutant Line's overarching mythology when she reported about the existence of Homo superior to a man named Senator Robert Kelly. Carol becomes marvelous. Carol would find herself as the chief of security at Cape Canaveral after a decade serving as a valuable agent in the USAF's Intel Division. As a testament to her reputation, NASA handpicked her to serve in this position. Little did Miss Danvers know that this would be the beginning of her transition from ace soldier to a bona fide superhero. It all began when Carol met a scientist and robotics engineer named Dr. Walter Lawson, who was in truth the assumed identity of the legendary Kree warrior hero, Mar-Vell. Now, Mar-Vell would end up becoming a superhero in his own right, namely the original Captain Marvel, and both he and Carol would pretty much become a hot item at Cape Canaveral. They'd end up sort of being a will they won't they kind of romantic entanglement over the course of Captain Marvel's tenure at the NASA base. Carol would eventually find herself taking on more of a proactive role under the Marvel Universe's spotlight when she ultimately unlocked her Kree gifts. It began when Miss Danvers was kidnapped by the Kree villain Yon-Rogg, who also happened to be the OG captain. Captain Marvel would ultimately rescue Carol, but not before she got bombarded by radioactive energy from a Kree device called a psyche magnetron. At the time, Carol had no idea that the device had tweaked her genetic structure, which in turn awakened her dormant Kree abilities like flight and energy projection. It would take weeks before she would finally get a grasp of what happened to her. In the interim, Carol started to experience blackouts for periods at a time, as the psyche magnetron allowed her mind to be possessed by the soul of a Kree warrior. Eventually, these blackouts led Carol to revisit the remnants of the psyche magnetron, where she then found what would eventually be her first superhero costume. It even came to a point where Carol had to let go of her job at Cape Canaveral due to the issues that arose whenever she got roped into the OG captain. But it's not like this was a dark chapter in Carol's life. After leaving the life of the soldier behind, she became a best-selling author and even managed to become an editor for a publication named Woman Magazine, a subsidiary of the Daily Bugle. It's here that she formed a friendship with the likes of Mary Jane Watson and, well, sort of a friendship with J. Jonah Jameson. On one hand, Carol was this hotshot novelist turned editor in the day, but on the flip side, she continued to have these blackouts. This resulted in her entire being overtaken by the Kree warrior spirit, who in turn had dubbed herself as the superhero Miss Marvel. Miss Marvel would go on to fight crime and evil in the Marvel Universe, with one of her early adventures involving the rescue of J. Jonah from a rampaging scorpion. After this whole debacle, Triple J branded Miss Marvel as a menace the same way he did Spider-Man. Carol would go on to take the identity of Miss Marvel amidst the persistent blackouts for a time. She'd eventually become one of Marvel's universe's top superheroes and would even find herself working with fellow crime fighter Jessica Jones, who at the time worked by the codename Jewel, and she'd form a lasting friendship with the future Avengers teammate Spider-Man. As time went on, Carol would find that her superheroic efforts had gradually overtaken her personal life. Still, she pushed through and continued to allow the Miss Marvel persona to overtake her own. Ultimately, Carol would reconcile her own identity with Miss Marvel during an adventure that involved a ton of friction between the two. In this particular story, Carol had a vision of her friend, Salia, dying. Before she could save her though, the Miss Marvel persona took over and instead went off to fight a different threat involving the elementals. A tug-of-war between the two psyches residing within Carol ensued, which culminated in Hecate helping her realize that Carol and Miss Marvel are one and the same. As a result, Carol was able to fully assume the identity of Miss Marvel and, well, pretty much become one whole person again. Her initial stint as Miss Marvel climaxed in an adventure where the high-ranking Kree agent Ronan the Accuser attempted to use her status as a half-human, half-Kree hybrid to destroy humanity with the help of an artifact called the Millennia Bloom. Ronan failed when he discovered that Miss Marvel and Carol's soul had already fully fused with each other, further cementing the fact that she'd come into her own. And Ronan got his butt kicked at the end of the story thanks to Miss Marvel and OG Captain Marvel's combined efforts. The many faces of Miss Danvers. You may not have known this already, but Carol Danvers is actually one of the few characters who went through numerous costume and superhero identities over the decades. Carol's transition from her first stint as Miss Marvel into her second one came in the form of a costume change. This all started when Janet Van Dyne, aka the Wasp, helped Carol make a new crime-fighting suit. Exchanging the designs of her old Kree-inspired suit, Carol decided to don a sleek black one-piece suit complete with thigh-high latex boots and gloves. It's all accentuated by a red sash on her waist, and Carol even had a new hairdo at this point. This was all an effort to bring the point home that she's a superhero in her own right, one who wasn't influenced by her Kree heritage anymore. She still goes by the Miss Marvel moniker though, implying that she's not completely turned her back on her interstellar roots. As you would expect, Carol would continue fighting crime and evil in this new suit, and as a testament to that, Miss Marvel would become part of the Avengers roster at this point. But it's not exactly a walk in the park. One of Carol Danvers' most harrowing episodes came when she blacked out yet again, but this time it had nothing to do with the Kree warrior possessing her body. In this instance, Carol woke up with no idea what happened to her. Then she immediately discovered that she was 3 months pregnant. To make matters worse, the bun in her oven was developing at an accelerated pace. The child she birthed from this pregnancy then aged at an inhuman rate as well, and he'd introduce himself as Marcus Immortus. Now, we won't go through this entire convoluted storyline here, but all you need to know is that what happened to Carol here was quite dark. Darker than even anything the Joker could think of. Fortunately, things went back to relative normalcy after this episode in Carol's life. The aftermath of that whole Marcus Immortus affair convinced Carol to leave the Avengers and move to San Francisco. Now, this whole time, the supervillain Mystique had her sights locked on Miss Marvel. To take down the superheroine, Mystique sicked the then evil Rogue into attacking Miss Marvel. Rogue then used her mutant abilities to absorb her powers, but not only that, Rogue siphoned Carol's energies so much that she even made her forget her memories. Carol would lose her powers for a time, but would retain her memories with the help of Professor X. From there, Carol would start working as a close comrade of the X-Men. She'd get reunited with her old friend Logan at this point too, as well as forming a close bond with the interstellar pirate crew named the Starjammers. In addition, we find out that Carol's entire DNA remained intact, although she had lost her powers. That is to say, she was still considered a perfect half-Kree hybrid, which played a part in allowing her to be able to be in peak physical condition. Carol's time with the X-Men would eventually lead her to a climactic confrontation against Rogue and Mystique. She'd ultimately manage to defeat the two with the help of the X-Men, and by the end of this adventure, Carol would prove to be invaluable to the Children of the Atom's efforts to clear the names of Senator Kelly's smear campaign against mutants. Miss Danvers' time without any superhuman powers would come to an end, however. After taking down Mystique and Rogue, she She and the X-Men then went on a space trip where Carol met the Shi'ar Empress, Lilandra. Carol and Marvel's premier mutants would then get roped into a dispute between Lilandra and the Shi'ar usurper Deathbird. This then resulted in Carol and the X-Men getting captured by Deathbird's allies, an alien race known as the Brood. The Brood discovered that Carol had an unusual genetic structure thanks to her half-Kree heritage, so they proceeded to conduct brutal experiments on her to unlock the potential of her DNA. This ultimately resulted in Carol acquiring cosmic superpowers akin to that of an actual star. She and the X-Men would escape captivity and defeat the Broods afterwards. Carol explained that her new abilities had come from the fact that her entire body fused with the fabric of the universe. This granted her the ability to channel and wield near unlimited cosmic energy, which manifested as light, heat, and radiation. Carol would then take on an entirely new superhero identity during this era, dubbing herself Binary. And after realizing that becoming Binary would now give her the opportunity to explore the vastness of space without any limits, Carol decided to leave the X-Men. Carol's tenure as the superhero Binary would end when she would eventually discover that her near unlimited cosmic powers were actually greatly reduced. Still, she was a formidable warrior in her own right, so Carol decided to rebrand again and started calling herself Warbird. After some time, Carol would also get to forgive and reconcile with Rogue, who has since become a force for good and a bona fide member of the X-Men again. On a side note, Rogue's transition from being one of Mystique's pawns to becoming a legit superhero involved a grueling chapter where the memories she absorbed from Carol gave her a sort of split personality. But that's a whole other can of worms that we could talk about in another video. Carol would assume the Warbird alter ego for quite some time before going back to the original Miss Marvel name. Her third stint as a superhero Miss Marvel saw Carol going on both solo adventures and universe-wide initiatives. This involved lots of adventures ranging from cosmic-themed ones to street-level threats, and hey, Carol would even find herself in Marvel's Mystic Corner from time to time. During Marvel's first Civil War event, Carol decided to join Tony Stark's side, and by the time the altercation between the pro-registration and anti-registration superheroes came to an end, Ms. Marvel became a part of the newly revamped Earth's Mightiest Heroes Avengers initiative. She'd continue to operate as part of the superhero team until the wider Marvel universe entered the Dark Reign era, when Norman Osborn assumed control of Earth's Mightiest Heroes. Carol would then refuse to work with Osborn, so the villainous bureaucrat formally stripped her of her Miss Marvel title and reassigned it to the reformed supervillain Carla Sofin. Still, Carla went on to continue bearing the Miss Marvel name until Osborn eventually fell from grace and Captain America took over the Avengers. From here, Miss Marvel would formally rejoin Earth's Mightiest Heroes under Luke Cage's leadership. Carol becomes the hero. And so we come to the point in Carol's life when she finally embraced both her human and Kree lineage. After decades of taking on various costumes and superhero identities, Carol ultimately took on the legacy title of Captain Marvel. That's arguably her biggest transition to date too. It all began during the Avengers vs. X-Men storyline, where the Phoenix made a beeline for the Kree homeworld. At the same time, a fanatic named Minister Marvel brought back the OG Captain Marvel to life. You see, Minister Marvel wanted to take advantage of the Phoenix Force's return to bolster Kree's Imperial army, so he harnessed its power to revive Mar-Vell and even attempted to take control of Carol's mind in the process. However, this plan blew up in his face when the Phoenix Force came knocking at Hala's door. In the end, Carol was able to free herself from Minister Marvel's influence, while the OG Captain Marvel gave up his life in order to stop the Phoenix from consuming the Kree homeworld. As a result of this selfless act, Carol decided to honor Mar-Vell's legacy and don the Captain Marvel mantle from then on. She'd take a personal blow in her life when she discovered the death of her longtime friend Helen Cobb, who gifted her with a plane. She'd then find out that this aircraft was all part of Helen's ruse before she died, one that involved Helen trying to gain control of Carol's superpowers from the Psyche Magnetron. Everything worked out for Carol when all was said and done, as Helen ended up sacrificing herself to allow Carol to go back to the present, and from there she decided to honor Helen's life as well as continuing to operate as Captain Marvel. She'd also find herself teaming up with the likes of Spider-Man and Monica during this time, but Captain Marvel's next big challenge arrived when she found out that the same power that allowed her to levitate and fly was also causing her brain damage. Steve Rogers helpfully tried to mitigate this by offering Carol to ride around on a flying motorcycle, but this ultimately proved to be a bandage solution as Carol found herself relying on her innate flight capabilities to effectively continue her duties as a superhero. Her condition further worsened when she fought against the original Captain Marvel's greatest nemesis, Yon-Rogg. Yon-Rogg in true fashion wanted to take control of Earth and turn it into his own kingdom, so Carol foiled his plans, but at a great cost. After defeating Yon-Rogg and saving the entirety of New York that saw her flying the alien despot into space, Carol's brain damage exponentially increased. This erased a huge chunk of her memories too. Afterwards, Carol made it her mission to gradually regain the memories she lost and would go on to become a celebrated hero in New York. In fact, she'd become an icon throughout the city. Her next adventure would take her in a familiar territory, space, where she stood against an army called the Builder Armada. She'd be captured by these interstellar enemies, but would eventually be rescued by the Avengers. However, this whole debacle left Earth open for Thanos to make a move against Carol's home planet in his bid to destroy his own son, Thane. But Carol ultimately managed to defeat the Mad Titan. She did this with the help of the other interstellar species who felt a debt of gratitude towards Captain Marvel and the Avengers after dealing with the Builders. Captain Marvel would go on to represent Earth's Mightiest Heroes Intergalactic Division, where she'd find herself in a number of cosmic adventures. She'd team up with the Guardians of the Galaxy from time to time during this era, as well as go off on her own solo interstellar trips. Her time in space crescendoed when she helped stop the supervillain Master Knife from using an artifact called the Black Vortex, a powerful object that would awaken the cosmic powers of anyone who used it. Carol would return to Earth after serving as a space hero for some time, where she'd then find herself embroiled in another squabble between Steve Rogers and Tony Stark. This time it was because Cap learned that Iron Man and a bunch of other heroes formed a secret group called the Illuminati, a shady collective who literally destroyed other realities in order to save their own. The saga climaxed when all of Marvel's heroes, including Captain Marvel, failed to prevent the final clash between the last remaining realities of the Marvel multiverse. However, there's a bright side here as Captain Marvel got to meet a girl named Kamala Khan. She's a teenager who happened to be an Inhuman and an absolute Carol Danvers fangirl, so Kamala took it upon herself to take on the Miss Marvel persona, with Carol pretty much calling the girl her successor. Marvel superheroes would eventually find a way to heal and restore the multiverse. Learning from their recent plight, Captain Marvel lobbied for a new group called the Ultimates to serve as a more honorable and palatable version of the former Illuminati. All the while, Carol became the head of the Alpha Flight Low Orbit Space Station as part of a larger space program meant to protect the universe from cosmic level threats. In addition to that, Carol's main job at the Low Orbit Alpha Flight Station was to serve as one of Earth's primary lines of defense against potential interstellar enemies. Eventually, Captain Marvel would head another initiative in hopes of protecting Earth with the help of the Inhuman named Ulysses Kane. You see, Kane had the ability to foresee huge threats before they could transpire. She only became more determined to push through this after a costly encounter against a mad Kree scientist named Minerva, which saw scores of innocent civilians getting taken out or genetically altered. This is where things get a bit morally ambiguous for Captain Marvel. Essentially, she tasked herself with capturing criminals and stopping crime before they even happened. It's a whole Minority Report sort of deal, which even saw Carol drafting her successor Kamala as part of her pre-crime team. Everything came to a head when Kane eventually missed the mark on one of her visions. This saw Captain Marvel arresting an innocent woman named Allison Green, which then led to another superhero v superhero feud. This time around, Iron Man, who was opposed to Carol's use of Kane's premonitions right from the start, gathered a number of other superheroes who shared the same sentiment. They then attempted to break Allison out of prison, but this ended with Iron Man and his pals fighting against Captain Marvel. Oh, and she wasn't alone either. Carol had a crew of her own made up of Alpha Flight subordinates and allies, as well as the Guardians of the Galaxy. Iron Man and his faction lost their bout against Captain Marvel, and to complicate things, Carol received another vision from Kane showing the second Spider-Man, Miles Morales, taking out Steve Rogers. Seeing this, Carol wanted to arrest Miles. This event reached its climax when Steve and Miles tried to prove that Kane's vision was incorrect. Another fight between Captain Marvel and Iron Man ensued, with Carol absolutely flatlining Tony and sending him into a coma. Shortly after that, Kane conveniently ascended to become a cosmic being, while Carol's social stock skyrocketed because of her hardcore dedication to protecting the world. This effectively turned Carol into arguably the planet's most powerful defender. And remember Allison Green, the woman that Captain Marvel initially branded as a dangerous criminal due to Kane's vision? Well, it would be eventually revealed that yeah, Allison was one naughty schemer who had an anti-superhero agenda of her own. In the end, Captain Marvel and her old friend Jessica Jones put a stop to her plans. Later, Captain Marvel would encounter someone named Mim, who would then be revealed to be an artificial being that Dr. Eve created. By the end of this adventure, Carol would discover who had been pulling Mim's strings and try to defeat the evil doctor. However, Mim would fall during their encounter while Eve would escape Captain Marvel's grasp. We then get a bit of reconciliation between Carol and her former teammate Black Panther after the Wakandan superhero cut ties with her. Unsurprisingly, we discovered that the reason Black Panther and the Ultimates decided to disband was because of Carol's increasing tendency to use their group for her own interests. Still, the Ultimates and Carol operated together in secret, although they maintained the position that they were formally disbanded. Captain Marvel would then fend off a potential Chitauri invasion, but at a great cost. The Alpha Flight Station, which served as a base of operations, was destroyed in the aftermath of the battle. But on the bright side, Carol was able to help restore Steve Rogers as the legitimate Captain America after he got swapped for a Hydra doppelganger somewhere in the middle of this adventure. Carol would then get sent to an alternate reality after Dr. Eve re-emerged. While there, Captain Marvel would gain possession of the Reality Stone, which she'd end up using to go back to her home dimension and maroon Dr. Eve in this foreign realm. She'd then tussle with the supervillain Blastar and defeat him with the Reality Stone. Shortly after that, Doctor Strange would invite Carol to join the newly revamped Infinity Watch, a group of heroes possessing the Infinity Stones. Disaster would strike not long after, as the superhero Gamora lost her mind and decided to keep all the Infinity Stones for herself. Gamora succeeded in doing so and tampered with the fabric of the universe. This caused an entity named Devondra to emerge, but Captain Marvel and Infinity Watch would successfully defeat this threat and restore the universe afterwards. Her next adventure was grander than the previous one, if you can believe it. This time, Carol and the rest of the Earth's mightiest heroes faced off against the Dark Celestials, who were revealed to be possessed by a race of parasites called the Horde. Captain Marvel would almost single-handedly take out the Horde, while the rest of Marvel's champions dealt with the Dark Celestials. Shortly after that, Captain Marvel would rejoin the Avengers as part of their roster. Not everything was peaches and cream though. The Avengers would soon diagnose Carol with anger management issues, which prompted her to take some time off from the team. She would visit her mom Mary, who at this point she only knew as a regular old human, to recuperate and do a bit of soul searching. However, the relative peace of home was disrupted when a Kree assassin tried to attack Carol and her mom. The fight that ensued forced Mary to reveal her true identity, that she was in fact a former Kree warrior named Mary L. She and Carol would defeat the Kree assassin, but Mary L would succumb to her injuries afterwards. She then returned to active duty in the Avengers, where Captain Marvel would reunite with Rogue to defeat the Nuclear Man. The War of the Realms would then break out sometime after that. Carol took command of Earth's defenses during this event, while also dabbling in magic when the Enchantress body swapped her with Doctor Strange. She and Strange would defeat Enchantress, and Carol would then assemble a war band called the War Avengers to serve in the front lines of battle. In the tail end of the war, Captain Marvel would face off against Cinder and so-called Queen of Cinders, the rule of Muspelheim. She then defeated the evil monarch, which ultimately led to the hero's victory. Afterwards, Carol and her prodigy Kamala would stop Dr. Walter Lawson from using a reconstructed Psyche Magnetron. Captain Marvel would then have to contend with the public opinion shortly after this. The media started a smear campaign against Carol after the revelations of her mother's true origins. The world then branded her as a traitor. However, Carol was able to regain public trust after she saved the world again. In this instance, Captain Marvel defeated a villain named Star, who had planned on absorbing the energy and life force of Earth's citizens to boost his own. The hits just keep on coming, as the supervillain Vox Supreme tried to hoodwink Carol into taking out her Avengers teammates. Vox would also be able to grab samples of their DNA in the process, but this would prove to be his own undoing, as Carol was able to use those samples to temporarily acquire her fellow Avengers' superpowers and subdue him. Captain Marvel then joined in defending Earth against one of the Kree's other ancient enemies, the Kotati. In this battle, she helped Hulkling, who has since become the leader of the Kree and Skrull alliance, to slow down the threat. It almost took her out, but Mr. Fantastic was able to revive her with the help of Ronan the Accuser's universal weapon. Afterwards, Carol became the new wielder of the universal weapon after that, which effectively turned her into the Kree-Skrull Alliance's new accuser. Captain Marvel would find herself beset by more problems during her tenure as an accuser. Her first mission was to bring a notorious Kree war criminal named Lor-El, which was then revealed to pretty much be her half-sister. So instead of taking out Lor-El, Carol decided to take her into custody on Earth. She'd then get help from Doctor Strange to replicate her universal weapon and distribute it to her friends Spider-Woman, War Machine, and Hazmat to establish the newly formed Accuser Corps. Ultimately, they discovered that the real target they've been looking for all along was Wastrel, the alter ego of Dr. Walter Lawson, and capture him. While on Earth, we discovered that Lor-El, like Carol, was strong enough to wield the universal weapon. With the Kotati threat still looming, Carol presented Hulkling with a proposal to put a permanent end to their enemies, sacrificing herself with the help of a powerful weapon called the Star Sword. But Hulkling refused and instead tried to activate the Pyre, a powerful world-destroying weapon. The Kree-Skrull Alliance leader had the intention of destroying all the Kotati along with humanity using the Pyre. To make sure Carol wouldn't interfere, Hulkling even dismissed her from the Imperial Court. However, she'd soon find out from Hulkling's husband, the superhero Wiccan, that the person who exiled her was actually an imposter. Captain Marvel and her allies would stop the Pyre, while the real Hulkling reclaimed his rightful throne to put an end to the Kotati without destroying Earth. Shortly after, Carol would relinquish her role as accuser for the Alliance and pass the universal weapon to Lor-El. Sometime later, Carol would find herself transported to an alternate dystopian future ruled by Ove, the son of Namor and the Enchantress. She'd become Ove's captive after she discovered that he was using magic's abilities by force to create his demon army. However, a resistance group made up of Emma Frost, Spider-Woman, and a group of young fighters who happened to be the sons and daughters of other superheroes rescued by Carol. A fight ensued, and Carol was transported back to her original timeline. With the knowledge of the possible future that would befall the world, Captain Marvel decided to do everything she could to prevent the rise of Ove. However, it all became a self-fulfilling prophecy when she ultimately let slip to Enchantress that her future son would become Earth's supreme ruler. Enchantress would summon Ove from the future to fight Captain Marvel, where Carol ultimately managed to strip Ove of one of his magical abilities and put a permanent stop to his eventual rise. After this adventure, Carol realized that she'd strayed too far from her original intention to be an honest-to-goodness superhero, so she decided to realign her priorities. Captain Marvel then teamed up with Phyla Vell to square up against the newly returned Vox Supreme. During the ensuing fight, Carol created a duplicate of herself, who in turn took on the role of the new Binary. In the end, Binary and Carol defeated Vox Supreme, although we find out that the Kree Supreme Intelligence had planned for this all along to bring the birth of this new Binary to the universe. Captain Marvel would take in Binary and help her adjust to life on Earth. After that, Carol would find herself on trial against Marvel's Mystics, mainly due to the whole Ove affair. She'd get trapped inside a makeshift world where Carol was a monster hunter with no memories of her past punishment. Scarlet Witch, however, would help Carol free herself from the simulated world and ultimately be granted release after Wanda vouched for her. While all this was happening, Binary had found herself unable to assimilate to Earth's ways, so Binary decided to leave for space, but ended up becoming hostage to the Brood. Captain Marvel then worked with the X-Men to help rescue Binary and Rogue, who had also been captured. Carol would ultimately find out that the Brood had been planning on attacking the Kree Empire using Captain Marvel. But remember guys, Binary is pretty much identical to Carol since she created her. A huge fight would ensue where Binary and Carol's combined efforts helped defeat the leader of the Brood, also known as its Empress. It proved to be a costly win though, because Binary got taken out in the process. This in turn triggered a power boost inside Carol, who then proceeded to take out their enemy. Sometime later, Captain Marvel found herself as the chairperson on Earth's Mightiest Heroes, where she proceeded to rebuild its roster. Not only that, but Carol also restarted the Avengers Academy, serving as a talent scout for young, up-and-coming superheroes. Next, Captain Marvel had to contend with the villains Nitro and Nada. On one hand, Nitro wanted to tarnish and put an end to the Captain Marvel legacy since he had a grudge against the OG. On the other hand, Nada just wanted some payback because Earth's interstellar garbage wrecked her home planet. To proceed with her plans, Nada controlled the minds of a bunch of regular civilians to fight against Captain Marvel and help her destroy the planet. But Carol managed to foil her plans with the help of Spider-Woman, and in the end, freed the mind-controlled citizens as well. Not long after that, Carol found herself cosmically entangled with a mystic named Yuna Yang when the young mage accidentally stole the artifact known as the Negabands from the villain Omen, an agent of the evil cosmic entity known as the Undone. The Undone and Omen pursued Captain Marvel and Yuna, where the young mage eventually found herself trapped inside the negative zone. This then severed her link with Captain Marvel. The Undone tried to consume Carol in order to feed on her energy, which allowed her to realize that the entities inside were part of the negative zone. This allowed Carol to rescue Yuna, but the Omen would end up taking out the young magic user. But not to worry, because Captain Marvel then used her powers to pull Yuna from the brink of death and defeat Omen while she was at it. Both Captain Marvel and Yuna then used the Negabands against the Undone to defeat the cosmic level threat, and in the aftermath, Carol finally had some downtime as she went back to Earth to get together with her loved ones.